We left off last week, beginning chapter 27. So we're just going to pick up there. Chapter 27, I told you we were kind of winding down the saga of David and Saul. There's a lot left, of course, with the life of David, but Saul's life is nearing an end at this point in the narrative. Chapter 27, David is going to flee to the Philistines. In chapter 28, you're going to see I won't say it's not really a surprise. What we've seen of Saul thus far, you're not really that surprised at his behavior in chapter 28. But it does show just how self-centered, I guess we would say, he's become. He will do anything to pursue his own ends and to try to accomplish his own end game. Chapter 29, you're going to see the Philistines. Some of the Philistine leaders are going to reject David. Then you'll see David's wives captured, and then David, of course, rescuing them and defeating the Amalekites there in chapter 30. And, of course, in chapter 31, the David and Saul narrative comes to its conclusion as Saul's going to die in battle. But that said, chapter 27, David decides, I'm going to, he has said multiple times he will not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. He's not going to kill Saul himself. Now, I don't know, I don't want to speak out of turn and say David's doubting here, but it seems that he's, it's the old expression, you pray like it all depends upon God and you act as if it all depends upon you. Maybe David is saying to himself, Saul just keeps coming after me. If I keep just hanging around the land, he's going to eventually get me. So maybe I need to just get out of Dodge, so to speak. So he decides he's going to defect, so to speak, to the Philistines. So he goes to the land of the Philistines, and he says, Saul, he'll just give up on me, is basically what he's saying there in verse 1. So that's what he does. He's got 600 men with him. He's going to dwell with Achish at Gath. And so it was told Saul that David was fled to Gath, verse 4. He sought no more again for him. So that part of the plan worked. Now, some of this is going to backfire on David, as you'll see later on. But that part worked. Saul's not coming after him anymore. Of course, the Philistines and the Israelites are constantly, or at least off and on, clashing throughout this section of Hebrew history. So by David going to the Philistines, he knew that, when there's a moment of peace between these groups, the Philistines and the Israelites, Saul's probably not going to mess that up trying to go chase David nonstop among the Philistines. So sure enough, that worked. So David tells Achish in verse 5, basically, if I found grace in your eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country that I may dwell there, for why should thy servant dwell in the royal city with thee? Well, he's wanting, I don't want to get beyond what's written and try to speculate too much, but he's saying here, I don't deserve special treatment. I think some of that is definitely David, just his character. David was never one to think that he deserved something so far and above everybody else. He was never one to want special treatment. But I think as you read through this chapter, you see there's kind of an ulterior motive. He wants to be able to run these, we might call them sorties, these raids on the Philistines. He can't do that if he's living in the royal city. So maybe that's something to do with it. Maybe that's just an offshoot, a side note that happened as a result of living out in a small town. But for whatever reason, David does say, just give me a little small town, simple place to live out in the country. I'm okay with that. So he did. He gave him Ziklag. And so Ziklag pertains to the kings of Judah unto this day, the writer of Samuel tells us. And the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was a full year and 4 months. This is, obviously a little bit different calendar, but it mentions gives a time frame, full year and 4 months. Wouldn't necessarily be the same as our year. It'd be a Semitic calendar. David and his men went up, invaded the Geshurites, the Gezrites, the Amalekites, For those nations were of old the inhabitants of the land, as thou goest ashore, even unto the land of Egypt. So David smites the land. Verse 9 says he doesn't leave man or woman alive. He takes away sheep, livestock, just basically everything. And he came to Achish. Achish says, whither have you made a road today? We would say really more or less, whither have you made a raid today? And David says, when he says road, it'd be kind of the idea of inroads. Where are you making inroads today? And he says, well, against the south of Judah, against the south of the Jerahmeelites, and against the south of the Kenites. But he doesn't say man or woman alive to bring tidings to Gath, saying, lest they should tell on us, saying, so did David, and so will be his manner all the while he dwelleth in the country of the Philistines. So Achish believes David, and he says, boy, he's really made his own people hate him now. I mean, he's carrying out raids against his own people. And so he's going to be my servant forever. David he's securing his standing among the Philistines is what he's doing. Again, this is one of those situations where the Bible records it, but it doesn't condone it. David is, he's lying, because he tells Achish, oh, I'm invading Judah. I'm making raids against Judah. I'm running these sorties against my own people. And he knows that's going to have Achish thinking, okay, well, he's really sideways of Saul for real. And I don't have to worry about him being a traitor. I don't have to worry about him not being trustworthy. He's shown. Again, there's a lot in this narrative with David and Saul that is very intriguing. It's not always people doing what they ought to do, but you feel sometimes like you're watching one of these movies where, you got a guy undercover and they say, okay, prove you're undercover. We want this guy dead. And so they, maybe they arrange it where it looks that way. Only David is carrying out raids, and he's killing people, just not the ones that he's saying he is, not the ones that Achish thinks. He's actually going against some of the Philistine people and some of the other inhabitants of the land. So you get into chapter 28. Chapter 28 kind of pauses this, and it's going to, and it kind of picks up in the beginning. Again, remember, chapter breaks are not in the original, but there's going to be kind of an interlude here with Saul and this witch or this medium of Endor. But it came to pass in those days, it begins the chapter, that the Philistines gathered their armies together for warfare. Again, off and on, they're fighting with the Israelites. It's just nonstop. In fact, that's how David got his claim to fame, right? There were these Philistines, and they're lined up across the valley from the Israelites, and the big giant Goliath comes out and shouts, send somebody over to fight me. It was just off and on. They were just clashing, which again goes back to earlier in our Hebrew history class. The Israelites were supposed to drive those people out, and they did not. And God says they're going to be a thorn in your side because you didn't do what you were supposed to do, what you were told to do. So Achish says to David, know thou assuredly that thou shalt go out with me to battle, thou and thy men. Plan's backfired now. Because what has David said over and over again? I will not lift my hand against God's anointed. And now Achish says, we're going to battle against your former master. And I've seen you've been telling me about those raids you're running against your people, and boy, here's your chance to really show what you got, David. We're going to fight. I know you're a stout fighting man, and so you're going to be my right-hand man in the battle, and we're going to go take on those Israelites. I wonder what David was thinking at that point. And so David, you sort of see David swallow hard. He says to Achish, surely thou shalt know what thy servant can do. Oh, you'll see what I can do. David's probably thinking, how am I going to get around this? Achish said to David, therefore will I make thee keeper of mine head forever. Keeper of mine head is another way of saying you're my bodyguard. And you're going to be right beside me in the battle. There's no sneaking around and tricking him at this point. So what's he going to do? Now, pause there. And it's kind of like in a movie, sometimes something is going on with a different character and it switches the scene. And so you see something going on with this one. Well, we're going to switch scenes now and go back to Saul. What's happening with Saul during all this? Well, we're going to find out. So Samuel's dead. We'd already talked about that last week. All Israel had lamented him. They buried him in Ramah, even in his own city. Saul had put away those that had familiar spirits and wizards out of the land. These people that were into these occult type activities. In fact, let's go ahead and look at this. We could look at this now or a little bit further into this account, but let me get some volunteers to read, please. I want to give you some verses. All right, Brother Ricky, Deuteronomy 18, verses 10 and 12. Who else? Billy, Leviticus 19:31. And when you finish that verse, just hold your spot there. I'm going to give you another verse in chapter 20. Robert, Exodus 22:18, please. And one more. Okay, Todd. Isaiah chapter 8, verse 19. And actually, I guess we're going to go in order. Exodus 22:18 would come first. Are you already there, Brother Robert? Okay. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. So this, everything about this is against God's law. Saul knows that. In fact, that's why I stopped here to mention it, because Saul had put away those that had familiar spirits and the wizards, the witches, the wizards, all these people that claim to be doing all these occult type activities. He's put them away. Now, they're not gone, right? Obviously. He's going to go see one in this context. They're not all gone. He's outlawed it, which was a good thing. That's what he should have done. But some of them are, kind of on the down low. They're continuing their craft, if you want to call it that. Their trickery is what I would call it. But what was the next one? Deuteronomy 18, 10, and 12. All right, he mentions the child sacrifice, Molech worship. That's the reference to making your son or daughter pass through the fire. But then he mentions those who practice witchcraft, soothsayers, interpreting omens, a sorcerer. And he says all who do those things are an abomination to the Lord. And he says this is part of the reason why God's driving those people out of the land. That kind of nonsense. Instead of looking to God, they're looking to, basically, to the devil. So, Leviticus 19:31. Is that Billy? Is that you? All right, no regard to mediums or familiar spirits. He says, I am the Lord. I am the Lord. You don't fool with that nonsense. You don't need that nonsense. All you need is Jehovah. He's the one true God. And then Billy, right there, same context, chapter 20, verses 6 and 27. Chapter 20, verse 6, and then verse 27, unless I may have a typo. Yeah. All right. So he says, anybody that turns to this type of thing, God's going to set his face against that person. They'll be cut off from the people. And then he says in verse 27 that this was a capital crime. It was to be punished with the death penalty, stoning. That's how seriously God took this. And then Isaiah 8, verse 19, Brother Todd. Should they inquire of the dead on behalf of the living? And he says, Isaiah here, by inspiration, says, should not a people seek their God? That's the problem when you get into this, is you're seeking, it becomes idolatry. You're seeking somewhere other than God. Concerning this particular context, coming back to 1 Samuel 28, I had a buddy in college that he was trying to tell me one time that he thought this was real, and as we go through this, you make your own conclusions. I don't think he stopped believing that after our conversation, but I told him I'm convinced that everything that this woman was involved in was a complete fraud, as it is today. Because, and here's the thing, even if it were real, I'm convinced it's not. And I think hopefully you'll see that as we go through and study this context. Even if it were, it's sinful, because just looking at these passages, you see God's position on it. God says that people ought to seek to their God. If you've got a problem, you don't need to go try and talk to the dead. You need to talk to your God. You don't need to be asking questions of the dead. You need to be asking God. And God's given us answers. We can go in His Word. Now, it may not be that my exact question, but there are principles that will cover every situation. He's given us all things pertaining to life and godliness. And so it becomes an issue of, am I going to seek to the realm of, the devil and that type of thing, or am I going to seek God? But I believe 100% this woman was a complete fraud, as are anyone, or as are all who claim to do such things. So Saul had put away the familiar spirits with good reason, because it was completely against God's will, and still is. The Philistines gathered themselves together. They came and pitched in Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel together, and they pitched in Gilboa. Saul sees this host of the Philistines in verse 5. He's afraid. His heart greatly trembled. He looks out and he sees Philistines coming out against us. Where David was in that group, we don't know at this point. But it is interesting that this comes right on the heels of Achish saying, come on, David, you're going to be my bodyguard. You're right there with me, and we're going to, we got the army now, and we're going to whoop the Israelites, and you're going to help us. So when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not. Verse 6, that's a key verse here. Neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. I won't get into a big thing with the Urim and Thummim. I covered that in the Q&A. It's probably been 5 or 6 months ago maybe. So if you got questions about that or want more information, then we'll look at that, and I can look up the exact date. But it's just something to do with how they would inquire of God. I don't know why that crazy. Maybe it doesn't like being in my suit pocket. But it's something to do with how they would sometimes inquire of God, and He would answer them. Now, this is obviously during a time when God would speak directly to maybe a prophet. Sometimes in the case of Moses, Samuel was an example. It was in an age of miraculous working. But God has gone quiet on Saul. And, we could probably unpack that a lot, but I think we could really sum it up by saying God had said all He was going to say to Saul. Have you ever, maybe with a child or maybe a loved one, maybe just a friend, you've said something and you've said something and you say, look, we're not going to keep talking about this. You know where I stand. And I'm not changing my position on this, because it's not, I'm not going to suddenly flip-flop and do the wrong thing or stand for what's wrong. We're not going to keep talking about it. I remember even as a child sometimes it might be something very trivial, but it was just something where Mama had said no. And you come, and sometimes we want to we'll try to wear them down or whatever. And, there were a couple times when my mom made it clear to me, you're about to get, not only is the answer going to be no, it's going to be no, and here's your punishment because you keep bugging me about it. There are times when she would just say, Chad, I've said all I'm going to say about this. If you're wise, you'll just shut up and let it go, because it's about to get bad for you. And that's kind of where God is with Saul. God has told Saul, you need to be faithful. You need to do what you're supposed to do. No amount of begging and pleading is going to make God change his mind and suddenly decide you're going to be king again. It's not happening. Maybe Saul is thinking to himself as he sees this host of Philistines, okay, this is it. This is where God is going to dethrone me, is in battle, and I'm about to die. I'm about to go meet my Maker. And maybe he knows I'm not ready to meet my Maker. I don't know. But God has said all he's going to say to Saul. And so God is not answering him in dreams, by the Urim, by the Thummim, nor by prophets. And so Saul is desperate. And so he says to his servant, seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit, a witch, sorcerer, sorceress, whatever, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, behold, there's the woman that hath a familiar spirit at Endor. So he disguises himself. He put on other raiment, and he went, and 2 men with him. They came to the woman by night, and he said, I pray thee, divine unto me by the familiar spirit, and bring me him up, whom I shall name unto thee. Well, he tells her to divine for him. I was looking for what I had something that another version, if I can find it. Oh, conduct a seance for me is what one version has. That's kind of the idea. He wants her to have some kind of a seance and call up a spirit from the dead, from the Hadean realm. You almost feel like we shouldn't be surprised by anything from Saul at this point. But it is still a little bit shocking, isn't it, when you think about what this says about Saul? He looks to God to advance his own standing. He looks to God when he feels like he's in trouble and he needs help and I got nowhere else to turn. Now he's going to reach out to God. He thinks there's something to this medium stuff, the witch, the sorcerer, whatever. Clearly he thinks there's something to it. Why did you outlaw it then, Saul? Maybe he thought if I do that, I can get in God's good graces and he'll bless me. See, it's all about Saul. What can God do for me? Yes, sir. Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I'd have to look. Somebody may, and I don't know if that would even be on a map. I'd have to look on a map to see if that. I think that is within Israel at that time. I'd have to find out. I think she's just operating on the sly, and he says to them, "Find me somebody." And in fact, later on, she's gonna tell him, "Oh well, Saul he's outlawed this. Don't you know what would happen to me?" And it's kind of like, again, kind of like you see sometimes in TV shows. The guy goes, he wants to buy some kind of illegal drug, and the guy says, "Don't you know this is illegal?" And he's testing you to see if make sure you're not a police officer or something. And it's almost like she's testing Saul to see what he's going to say. Hey, don't you know this is illegal? And that's what he's going to say. Ironically, by the way, this is another one of those that, again, we shouldn't be surprised, I guess. But ironically, he swears to her by the Lord that nothing's going to happen to you. I swear to God, nothing is going to happen. You just do what I ask. And that was another thing I was going to say. It says a lot about Saul. He changes his standards to fit his needs. When he thinks God's going to bless him, or when God is blessing him, and he thinks it's going to maybe better his standing with God and keep the blessings coming, then he outlaws witches and wizards and sorcerers and all that. But now God's not speaking to him, and he's desperate, and he's trying to find out what's going to happen, and he wants to know something. So, now the standard changes. Everything with Saul is about Saul, and it's just it really is sad when you get down to it. But remind me, Robert, I want to look and see if that is. Do what? It's within Manasseh. Okay, I was thinking it was in the territory of Israel. So it's within the territory of the tribe of Manasseh. Is that Transjordan or this side of Jordan? Eastern or Western is what I'm trying to say. It doesn't say. Because, there was a half-tribe Manasseh. But either way, that would be in Israel's territory. So that answers the question. Thank you, Brother Hooper. So yeah, she must have just been doing this on the sly. So the woman says, verse 9, that's when she says, you know what Saul's done. He's cut off those that have familiar spirits, wizards out of the land. You're laying a snare for my life, buddy. You can't do this, and this is illegal. And so this is when, again, ironically, Saul swears, by the Lord, as the Lord liveth, there shall no punishment happen unto thee for this thing. So she says, well, whom shall I bring up? And he says, bring me up Samuel. And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice, and the woman spake to Saul, saying, why hast thou deceived me, for thou art Saul? There are three things here that I think convince me, and I think that they're evidence that she is a fraud. She conducts this seance, and she is as surprised as anybody when Samuel comes up. I suspect she's done this countless numbers of times, and she would say something like, I see a spirit, and maybe she's just making things up, because she's quite shocked when Samuel appears, and she screams. I think that's evidence number one. She also, by the way, figures out this is Saul. How does she know? I don't know. It may be that Samuel, when he appeared, called out to Saul. And that may have been part of why she was very frightened. And she realizes this is not going at all like my typical so-called seances go. So she cries out and she says, well, time out. Okay, there's really a spirit here, number one. Number two, you're the king. You're Saul. And so Saul says to her, don't be afraid. Tell me, what did you see? What do you see? And she says, I saw gods ascending out of the earth. Does anybody know what this word is in Hebrew? I suspect you do. Same word that used in Genesis 1. Elohim. And it's, we sometimes think, well, why on earth would Elohim, gods, plural, be used in Genesis 1? Why would it be, by the way? Father, Son, Holy Spirit, all three members of the Godhead involved in creation. And that's why you read even in the King James where you don't get that sense of Elohim just from the word God or Lord. It'll say, let us make man in our image, those plural pronouns. That's why it's three members of the Godhead there. So she says, I saw gods. Now, she's not saying I see God. What she's saying is she sees some kind of celestial being. Again, I think there's evidence here. She doesn't say, oh, it's Samuel. She thinks she's called up some kind of an angelic, or maybe even quite likely this lady is pagan. She probably thinks she's called, inadvertently called up some kind of a god. Again, I think that's evidence she doesn't know what she's doing. This is fake, and she's as surprised as anybody that, wait a minute, there's really someone here. So I think that's evidence number two. And so she says, this is some kind of a god ascending out of the earth. So then Saul's, and isn't this amazing? The pagan is scared to death by all this. And the servant of God is the one who, he ought to be scared, because he's doing as wrong as anybody. And he just wants to know, tell me, what do you see? Tell me what he's like. What does he look like? And so he says, tell me, what does he look like? She says in verse 14, it's an old man. He's covered with a mantle. And, Saul says, that's Samuel. And he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed himself. I don't know what he thinks Samuel's going to do for him at this point, that God has departed from him. But Samuel said to Saul, why hast thou disquieted me to bring me up? Obviously, God is doing this to make a point to Saul. And Saul answered, I am sore distressed. The Philistines make war against me. God has departed from me, answers me no more, neither by prophets, by dreams. Therefore I've called you, Samuel, that thou mayest make known unto me what I shall do. And Samuel said, what are you asking me for? If God's not answering you, what do you think I'm going to tell you? I mean, Samuel from start to finish was a servant of God. He's not going to, it's almost, I don't know, maybe Saul's thinking here, put in a good word for me or something, but Samuel says same thing he told him before. Well, why are you asking me when the Lord's departed from you and he's become your enemy? Yeah. I think probably, and Billy's referencing just a little bit here, where he says, the Lord's done to him as he spake by me. For the Lord hath rent the kingdom out of thine hand, given it to thy neighbor, even to David. And he says, because you didn't obey the Lord in the matter of Amalek, that's why all this has happened. And he says, God's going to deliver Israel into the hand of the Philistines. Verse 19, tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord also shall deliver the host of Israel into the hand of the Philistines. I think what he's talking about there is the Hadean realm, which has two compartments. You have, and sometimes, in fact, you'll see this in our sermon this morning in the worship hour. Jonah talks about being in the belly of hell. Sometimes you'll see that word in the King James in the Old Testament, when the word actually is Sheol in the Hebrew, and it means the unseen realm. In the New Testament, you'll sometimes see the word hell when it's Hades or Hades in the Greek. And we've talked about it before. In Luke 16, the rich man and Lazarus, and Abraham says to the rich man, there's a great gulf fixed between, so that you can't go from one to the other. So there's this unseen realm, the Hadean realm. There is paradise, as Jesus refers to it, or Abraham's bosom in Luke 16. Be the same place. And then there's torment, is the way Luke 16 puts it, or Tartarus is the way it's put in 1 Peter or 2 Peter, I think. But yeah, I think probably saying in the Hebrew realm, in the Hadean realm, unless, it could be that, but there's no indication that Saul ever got right. So without that indication, I certainly wouldn't speculate and say that, but sometimes people say, well, if he was this bad, how could he say that? I would think that's probably the most likely explanation, is that he's saying, hey, either that or just saying you're going to be like I am this time tomorrow. You're going to be dead, or at least out of this world, not understanding that with the understanding that the soul lives on. So the Philistines are going to conquer Israel. He says you're going to lose this battle tomorrow. You and your sons, you're going to be just like me. You're going to be dead. You're going to be in the Hadean realm. Saul fell straightway all along the earth. He's kind of paralyzed. It's really terrified him. And of course, part of this is because there's no strength in him, because he hadn't eaten or drunk all day. So the woman comes to Saul and saw that he was sore troubled. She comes over to him to try to, to sort of help out. And she says, I've obeyed your voice. I put my life in your hand. I've done what you said. Now listen to me. You need to eat. He refused, said he wouldn't, but she basically presses upon him and says, you need to eat. So she goes and prepares some food for him. They rose up at the end of verse 25 and went away that night. So you get into chapter 29. Essentially, in chapter 29, what's going to happen is some of these princes of these districts of the Philistines, you got these chief cities of the Philistines, 5 cities. Some of them start saying to Achish, hey, this is David, Achish. Have you forgotten who this guy you're making your bodyguard, your right-hand man? Have you forgotten who he is, what he did to the Philistines? And what is it that all the people said of David? Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. But of course, Achish he's telling him, hey, he's done nothing but good for me. Of course, Achish doesn't know about those raids. But they say, no, you need to send David back. He's not going with us to battle, lest he swap sides in the heat of the battle, which is probably what David would have ended up doing, because we've already seen he's not going to lift a finger against Saul or the nation of Israel. So probably he would have, maybe mid-battle or something, turned on the Philistines. Who knows? But they say, no, we're not taking David. In verse 5 is where they mention, hello, this is David, of whom they sang one to another in dances, saying, Saul slew his thousands and David his 10,000s. They're saying to Achish, you're out of your mind. We're not taking this guy into battle with us, lest he slay 10,000 more. So Achish calls David and says, look, you've been nothing but good to me, and I'm so sorry about this. I don't know what to do, but they're just, they're being really stubborn about this, and they're not going to change their mind, and I can't do nothing with them, David. You just gonna have to turn around and go back. And I hope you won't be upset with me about that. And so David says, well, what have I done? and maybe David had a plan here, because he seems pretty upset about this. You figure this is kind of good news for David. You could pretend to be upset about it. Maybe that's what he's doing, just pretending to be upset. But he seems genuinely upset about it. So maybe he had a plan in mind. Who knows? But David basically says, well, what have I done? Why, what have I done it wrong since I've been with you? And so Achish tells him, look, I know you're good in my sight as an angel of God. It's just a way of saying, kind of an expression, saying you're a stand-up guy. Notwithstanding the princes of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to the battle. So he says, get up early in the morning, you and your servants, and just go on home. And David and his men rose up early to depart in the morning, to return to the land of the Philistines. And the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So you get to chapter 30. The first 15 verses here, you've got David's wives are captured. And again, this is not necessarily chronological. This may not be exactly why David is gone in this particular time, but it may very well be that it is. It's just sometimes you have to understand not everything in Samuel is chronological, and sometimes people get confused because they assume everything is. But he comes to Ziklag. He finds the Amalekites had invaded the south, Ziklag. They had smitten Ziklag, burned it with fire. They took the women captives. They slew not any either great or small, but carried them away and went on their way. Maybe some providence of God in this. No one was killed. They were just taken captive. So they come to the city. Behold, it was burned with fire. Their wives, sons, daughters taken captive. So David and the people that were with him lifted up their voice and wept till they had no more power to weep. David's two wives were taken captives, Ahinoam and Abigail. David is distressed because now the people speak of stoning him. Well, isn't that kind of how people sometimes do? Things go bad and they just sometimes turn on each other. Well, it wasn't necessarily David's fault. I guess in a sense, David could have been blamed because he'd played up to the king of Gath there, Achish. But be that as it may, the people are ready to stone him. The soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. David doesn't turn on them. He's going to put his faith in God. It shows a lack of trust in God on their part. David says to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod. He does, and David inquires, and God basically says, yes, go after them. You're going to recover everything. So he goes, and the 600 men that are with him, they come to the brook. You've got 200 men that stay behind. They're faint. They're tired. They can't make it. They've got to take a break. But David doesn't want to stop pursuing because he wants to catch up and try to recover everything and take over. So those 200 men, they stay right there. So they find an Egyptian. They bring him to David. They revive him with some bread and water. And they give him a cake of fig, cluster of raisins. And so now he perks up a little bit is what we would say. And David asks him, who do you belong to? And he says, well, I'm a servant of an Egyptian. And he says, I'm a young man of Egypt. My master left me. I fell sick, and he just left me to die. And so he says basically to David, I'll take you to their camp. If you just promise me you'll look after me and not return me to my master. He's a slave. He doesn't care about his master because obviously this guy's not treating him very well. So he says, look, you help me out, and I'll tell you exactly where they are. David finds them, and beginning there in verse 16, 17, he begins to attack, and he utterly defeats those people. And he comes back. He recovers everything just like God would. He came to the 200 men, and some of the people said what? They don't get any of the spoil. They stayed behind. And David says, that's not how it works. These were not men that just decided we're not going to go to the battle. We don't want any part of it. They were faint, they were tired, they were exhausted. They had to have a break. And so he says, no, we're all included on the spoil. Verse 23, that you shall not do so, my brethren, with that which the Lord hath given us, who hath preserved us and delivered the company that came against us into our hand. For who will hearken unto you in this matter? But as his part is that goeth down to the battle, so shall his part be that tarrieth by the stuff. They shall part alike. So they did. They divided everything up, and David goes back to his area. And then what we'll do next week, Lord willing, I was hoping so bad to get through chapter 31, but we'll look very quickly at the battle there in chapter 31, see the death of Saul and his sons, and then we'll get into the 2 Samuel. Again, this is in the original, it's just one book. And so what's going to happen is the focus will shift now to David and the establishment of his kingdom. Thank you very much for your attention. We'll have a break before our worship hour.